The forgotten U.S. bullet Japan feared most. It turned zero fighters into fireballs. January 15th, 1943, Solomon Islands. The first light over fighter strip number 2 revealed a patchwork of muddy ground, metal fuel drums, and rows of tired aircraft that had flown almost every day for weeks. Ground crews moved between the planes with slow, deliberate motions. Their uniforms were stained with oil and dust. The heat was already rising. First Lieutenant Daniel Reeves, 24 years old, walked toward his P-38 Lightning while adjusting the chin strap of his flight helmet. Reeves had grown up on a farm outside Hastings, Nebraska. Before the war, he flew small aircraft for crop-dusting jobs across the Midwest. He had no combat experience when he enlisted, just steady hands and good instincts with an aircraft. After training in California and brief assignment stateside, he was transferred to the 39th Fighter Squadron, part of the 13th Air Force, operating over the Solomon Islands. Reeves' role was clear: intercept Japanese fighters, protect American bombers and supply flights, and prevent enemy aircraft from reaching Allied ground positions. His tasks required long patrols, quick reactions, and maintaining altitude advantages over the Zero, a fighter known for its agility and lethal performance in close-range combat. He performed a careful walk-around inspection of his P-38, touching the wing route where mechanics had loaded ammunition hours earlier. He didn't know the specifics of the rounds. Pilots rarely checked new batches unless told to. He trusted the ground crew. They trusted whatever was shipped to the island. At 7:55, Reeves climbed into the cockpit. The metal seat felt cold despite the humid air. He strapped in tightly, checked his instruments, and opened the vents to reduce cockpit fogging. His wingman that morning, Flight Officer Samuel Red Torrance, signaled from the next aircraft over. Torrance was younger, only 21, a former mechanic who had transitioned to flight school after demonstrating exceptional aptitude. This would be his 9th mission. Reeves' main tasks during the patrol were simple on paper. Climb to patrol altitude along the coastline of New Georgia. Identify any inbound enemy formations. Engage Zeros only with altitude and speed advantage, never in level-turning fights. Return to base with fuel reserve if combat prolonged more than 8 minutes, as the P-38 engines consumed fuel rapidly during extended climbs. At 8:03, Reeves pushed the throttles forward. The twin engines roared, vibrating through the cockpit floor. His aircraft accelerated across the uneven runway, lifted cleanly, and began climbing into a hazy sky. At 6,000 feet, the ocean appeared flat and reflective beneath scattered clouds. Reeves leveled off briefly for a systems check. Fuel pressure normal, oil temperature stable, guns armed. At 8:12, his radio crackled with an incomplete transmission from ground radar. Eagle, multiple contacts, east of your position. Altitude near 8,000. Static swallowed the rest. Reeves adjusted his heading. Torrance formed up on his right, maintaining spacing. As they climbed to 8,500 feet, Reeves began scanning the horizon sector by sector. The training emphasized continuous motion, never focusing on one direction too long. His eyes moved across the sky, from cloud tops to the faint blue line near the horizon. At 8:19, Reeves spotted 6 aircraft approaching from the northeast. They flew in a loose V formation, descending gradually. The distance closed quickly. The silhouettes confirmed what he already suspected: a 6 M0 fighters, likely from Rabaul or the Shortlands. He informed Torrance calmly over the radio. 6 bandits at 10 o'clock high. Maintain altitude. Do not turn with them. The Zeros adjusted their path toward the Americans, confident in their ability to outmaneuver nearly every Allied aircraft. Reeves knew their tactics well. Force a turn, trap pilots in low-speed maneuvering, and strike from tight angles where they excelled. Reeves kept climbing, holding the altitude advantage. His hands were steady, but he was fully aware of the danger. This was his 26th combat flight. He had seen men vanish into cloud layers and never return. At 8:23, the engagement began. Reeves pushed the nose down into a control dive, lining up a high-speed pass. He centered his gun sight on the lead Zero. His finger tightened on the trigger. The P-38's 4.50 caliber guns and 20 millimeters cannon fired in a short, measured burst. The tracers streaked forward. But what happened at impact was unexpected. The round struck the Zero's right wing root, producing a sudden, bright flash. A burst of flame followed instantly, spreading across the wing's surface. The Zero banked sharply, lost lift, and entered a burning spin toward the water below. Reeves blinked once, recalibrating. He had hit aircraft before, but Zeros usually disintegrated from structural damage or fell after multiple bursts. They did not ignite so quickly. He zoom climbed, repositioned, and made another pass. He fired at a second Zero crossing in front of him. The same result: a clear, bright flash at impact and immediate flames consuming the fuselage. Reeves didn't speak for several seconds. His breathing slowed. His training told him that the rounds had performed differently, much differently. He didn't know the name M54 incendiary yet. He only knew that today, his gunfire produced effects he had never seen. Torrance's voice broke through the radio. "Dan, did you see that? They caught fire." "Stay focused," Reeves replied. "Make another pass." The remaining Zeros disengaged, climbing away and fading into cloud cover. Reeves and Torrance regrouped and set course for home. The patrol had lasted barely 30 minutes. At 9:04, Reeves landed, taxied toward the fuel pit, and shut down his engines. Ground crews approached immediately. A mechanic, Corporal Hansen, pointed at the scorch marks around the gun ports. "Looks like those new rounds did something." "How they perform?" Reeves removed his helmet slowly. "They worked," he said. "Better than anything we've had." He didn't give more detail. The full explanation would come later, in intelligence meetings, ammunition reports, and after-action briefings. But on that morning, standing beside his aircraft with engines still ticking from heat, Reeves understood one thing clearly. Something had changed in the fight against the Zero. The afternoon rains came quickly over Guadalcanal. They fell in short, heavy bursts that left the air thick and the ground soft. Inside the squadron's operations tent, pilots sat around a long wooden table, their flight suits half unzipped, boots covered in red island mud. A single lantern hung from a rope overhead, swaying slightly in the wind. First Lieutenant Daniel Reeves sat among them, listening as the intelligence officer reviewed enemy activity from the previous month. On the chalkboard behind him, casualty numbers were listed in uneven handwriting. Reeves had stopped counting how many names he recognized. Before the arrival of the new ammunition, the pilots of the 39th Fighter Squadron had faced the same reality every morning. Japan's Zero fighters, with superior maneuverability at low speeds, held the advantage in most engagements. American pilots relied on diving attacks, coordinated teamwork, and strict avoidance of turning battles. Even so, the losses had been heavy. The squadron commander, Major Howard Kincaid, stood at the front of the room, arms crossed. Kincaid was in his mid-30s, older than most men under his command. He had flown in the early stages of the Pacific Campaign and carried a calm, steady demeanor that helped stabilize the younger pilots. Kincaid spoke without raising his voice. "Review the pattern. The Zero closes distance quickly. If you let it dictate the fight, you will not come back." Reeves glanced at Torrance, sitting beside him. Torrance kept his hands folded, eyes focused on the map. The younger pilot had lost a close friend 2 weeks earlier, a man he had trained with in California. The loss affected him deeply, though he rarely discussed it. The intelligence officer pointed to a red grease pencil circle marking the last major air engagement. "Most of our rounds pass through the Zero's airframe. You know this already. Their aircraft are light and lack armor. But unless you hit fuel or oil directly, they keep flying." This had been a demoralizing truth since the beginning of the campaign. Pilots returned from sorties describing enemy fighters that showed spark from impacts but maintained full maneuverability. Some Zeros even completed full attack runs after taking multiple hits. Reeves remembered his own experiences clearly. He recalled firing long bursts that ripped metal from a Zero's wing, only to watch the pilot bank away, regain speed, and re-enter the fight. He never forgot the frustration that followed those moments. the sense that survival depended more on the Zero pilot making a mistake than on the American pilot's efforts. The room grew quieter as the officer continued. In the last 4 weeks, 10 of our pilots have been lost or severely wounded. Most engagements happen at altitudes where the lightning strengths are limited. Your survival depends on altitude control, timing, and short, accurate bursts. Major Kincaid stepped forward again. We do not have replacement pilots coming fast enough. You are the ones holding this position. Every sortie matters. This was not an exaggeration. The Solomon Islands campaign depended heavily on maintaining air superiority around Guadalcanal and New Georgia. American ground forces, supply convoys, and reconnaissance flights relied on fighter cover. Without it, the Japanese could cut supply lines, bombard positions, and isolate entire units. Reeves understood this clearly. Each mission was not just about scoring victories. It was about keeping bombers alive, keeping supply aircraft safe, and preventing Japanese forces from regaining control of the skies. After the briefing, Reeves stepped outside the tent. The rain had stopped, but the ground glistened with puddles reflecting light from the clouds. Mechanics moved between aircraft, checking hydraulic lines, fuel caps, and ammunition belts. Torrance joined him. "They keep telling us to fire short bursts," Torrance said. "But half the time, it's luck whether we hit anything that matters." Reeves nodded. "That's how it's been. Unless you hit fuel, they stay in the air." Torrance kicked a small stone aside. "We're flying missions where the odds aren't even." Reeves didn't respond immediately. For months, that statement had been accurate. Their aircraft were fast but heavy. Their opponents were lighter, agile, and flown by pilots with years of combat experience. The Americans had improved tactics and better coordination, but results often depended on precise hits under extreme pressure. That imbalance shaped the mindset of every pilot. They entered combat knowing that a mistake of 1 or 2 seconds, a missed angle or a turn taken too slowly, could be fatal. That night, Reeves reviewed his flight notes under a dim lantern. He wrote short entries, mostly about weather conditions, enemy behavior patterns, and fuel calculations. But he also wrote about something else, the 2 Zeros he had shot down earlier. Minimal rounds fired, immediate ignition, unusual behavior, need to confirm ammo type. He didn't yet know the details behind the new ammunition, but the effect had been too clear to ignore. Something had shifted, not enough to end the danger, not enough to erase the Zero's superiority in close combat, but enough to change the balance, even slightly. For the first time in many months, Reeves ended a day believing the squadron might gain a sustainable advantage. The men still faced long odds, and the Zero remained a dangerous adversary. Yet there was now a possibility, however small, that survival was no longer a matter of luck alone. That possibility mattered. The next morning brought clearer skies and slightly cooler air over fighter strip number 2. Clouds drifted slowly above the tree line, leaving patches of sunlight across the runway. Reeves walked along the aircraft line with a small notebook in hand, recording maintenance notes and ammunition observations from the previous day's mission. Ground crews were already working. Fuel hoses hissed. Toolboxes slammed shut. Ammunition belts were laid out on canvas sheets, each round checked by hand. Reeves noticed new crates with stencil markings that had not been there a week earlier. The mechanics inspected them with quiet interest. Corporal Hansen approached, wiping grease from his fingers. "Morning, Lieutenant. We're loading the same ammo you had yesterday." Reeves studied the belt Hansen held up. The rounds looked similar to standard .50 caliber ammunition, but several had different tip color markings. Reeves wasn't an ammunition specialist, but he had enough experience to recognize tracer rounds, armor-piercing rounds, and ball ammunition. These new ones were different. "What are those?" Reeves asked. Hansen shrugged. "Incendiary type. Came in with the last supply run from Espiritu Santo. We didn't get a full briefing, just instructions to integrate them." Reeves ran a finger along one of the cartridges. The tip had a dull silver finish with a small marking near the crimp. "Who authorized the mix?" "Ordnance Division," Hansen replied. "So they're meant to ignite fuel more reliably." "That's all we know." This was the first confirmation Reeves had received. The rapid ignition of the enemy fighters yesterday made more sense now. The M54 incendiary round, though he didn't know the official designation yet, was designed to ignite on impact and generate extreme heat for a fraction of a second. That was enough to set fuel vapors or thin aluminum skins ablaze. Reeves looked toward the jungle beyond the runway. Japanese aircraft were built to be fast and agile. To achieve this, designers had removed almost every form of protection. The A6M0 had several inherent weaknesses. 1. No self-sealing fuel tanks. Fuel tanks were simple aluminum structures. When hit, they leaked quickly. Worse, leaked fuel produced vapor, a highly combustible environment inside the wing. 2. Thin exterior skin. The metal covering the wings and fuselage was lightweight, making it easy to puncture. Even minor impacts could expose fuel lines or internal compartments. 3. No armor plating around the cockpit or engine. Japanese designers prioritized maneuverability and range. Armor was considered unnecessary weight. As a result, a single incendiary strike near the fuel system could disable the aircraft instantly. 4. Exposed fuel and oil lines. Running along the wing roots and beneath the cockpit floor, these lines were vulnerable to even glancing hits. Reeves had known these weaknesses in theory. Every pilot received briefings about them. But until the new ammunition arrived, exploiting those weaknesses required precise hits, sometimes too precise for the chaos of combat. Later that morning, Reeves sat with Major Kincaid in the operations tent. A large map of the Solomon Islands covered the table. Pencil markings tracked recent Japanese flight paths, raid timings, and climb patterns. Kincaid leaned forward, speaking quietly. "I read your report from yesterday. You noted immediate ignition on both targets." "Yes, sir. It wasn't structural failure. It was fire. It happened too fast to be anything else." Kincaid nodded. "We're hearing similar accounts from other squadrons. These new rounds might give us a more reliable way to bring them down." Reeves considered this. For months, pilots have been firing thousands of rounds to achieve single kills. A zero that burst into flames from 1 or 2 hits represented a significant shift. Kincaid tapped the map with a pencil. "But remember, their pilots are still experienced. They won't stop pressing attacks just because we have new ammunition." Reeves agreed. "Sir, the zero still outturns us. If we get caught slow or low, we're still at a disadvantage." "That doesn't change," Kincaid replied. "But if these rounds increase the chance of igniting fuel, then every burst you fire is more meaningful." In the afternoon, Reeves joined Torrance near their aircraft. Torrance was cleaning his gun sight lens with a cloth. "Heard about the ammo," Torrance said. "Some of the older guys are calling it firebug. Says it makes zeros go up easy." Reeves sat on the wing edge. "It won't replace tactics, but it helps." Torrance looked up. "Do you think it changes the war?" Reeves paused before answering. "It changes how we fight. That's enough for now." To their west, a line of dark smoke marked where engineers were burning garbage near the edge of the strip. Above it, the sky was quiet, an unusual moment of calm. Reeves closed his notebook. The Zero's weaknesses had always been known: fuel, structure, and protection, or the lack of it. But now, with new incendiary rounds, those vulnerabilities mattered in ways they never had before. The pilots still faced danger. The enemy still held advantages. But for the first time in months, American fighters had a tool designed specifically for the conditions of this theater. Something small, a single bullet type, had begun altering the balance in the air. And tomorrow, that change would be tested again. The morning skies over Kalimbangara were pale and steady, with layered clouds stretching across the horizon. Visibility fluctuated between clear bands and dense patches of mist. It was the kind of weather that often hid enemy fighters until they were nearly overhead. At 9:18, Reeves and 4 other pilots from the 39 Fighter Squadron were assigned to escort a formation of B-24 Liberators returning from a bombing run against Japanese supply facilities on Bougainville. The Liberators were large, slow, and vulnerable during their long return route. Their safety depended on fighter cover, maintaining altitude and distance discipline. Reeves flew on the left side of the escort formation. His tasks were simple in concept, but demanding in execution. Maintain a position 1,500 feet above the bombers. Watch for climbing Japanese interceptors approaching from coastal airfields. Engage threats quickly before they reach the B-24s. Avoid descending into a turning fight. His wingman for this mission, Torrance, flew slightly behind and lower, watching the right side of the formation. The Liberators droned steadily below, four-engine silhouettes moving through shifting cloud layers. Reeves scanned ahead, then to the east, then above, a continuous cycle. At 9:27, the first warning came. Multiple bandits rising from the west. B-24 tail gunner reported over the shared channel. Looks like 9, possibly more. Reeves tightened his grip on the throttle controls. The Zeros appeared seconds later, emerging from cloud cover in climbing formation. They were fast, coordinated, and moving directly toward the bombers. Eagle lead, engaging, Reeves announced. The Japanese pilots pressed the attack immediately. 3 Zeros angled upward toward the trailing Liberator. Their tactic was clear: target the bomber's weak underbelly before the escorts could react. Reeves pushed his P-38 into a shallow dive. The nose of his aircraft aligned with the approaching fighters. He fired a controlled burst to the lead Zero. The incendiary round struck just behind the cockpit. A sharp flash erupted, followed instantly by flame spreading along the fuselage spine. The Zero rolled right abruptly and began losing altitude. Reeves didn't follow it down. He pulled back into a climb to regain position. Radio chatter spiked. Zero on my tail. They're splitting into 2 groups. Watch your altitude. Another Zero swept across the top of a Liberator, attempting to position itself behind the bomber's left waist gun. Reeves banked hard, closed distance, and fired again. The incendiary rounds hit the wing root. Flames appeared almost immediately, spreading through the leaking fuel. This was the second Zero to ignite during the engagement, again with minimal rounds fired. The bomber gunners acknowledged the assist. Good hit, Lightning. He's going down. But the fight was not finished. For more Zeros maneuvered aggressively, shifting between cloud openings and diving arcs. Torrance broke, left sharply. 2 coming in on the center bomber. I'm moving to intercept. Reeves scanned the formation. The B-24s were still flying in a tight box pattern, maintaining cohesion. Every moment of delay increased their vulnerability. He dove again, faster this time. He lined up on the Zero, closing from above. The Japanese pilot attempted to roll away, but Reeves' altitude advantage gave him a shot. A burst of tracers reached the Zero's tail section. The incendiary round struck near the fuel line. A brief flash followed, then the aircraft lost control. 3 Zeros had been destroyed by incendiary impact alone. For the next several minutes, the remaining Japanese pilots shifted tactics. Instead of pressing straight attacks, they began climbing away after each pass, using speed to escape before the escort fighters could reposition. This was a noticeable change, one that suggested caution or confusion. Reeves rejoined Torrance at 10,000 feet. Their breathing was calm but focused. You see that? Torrance asked. They're pulling off quicker than usual. They're not sure what they're facing, Reeves replied, but they know it's working. By 10:40, the Japanese fighters had disengaged fully and descended toward cloud cover, ending the attack. All B-24s survived the engagement. When Reeves landed on fighter strip number 2, a group of ground crewmen approached immediately. They had listened to the radio reports and heard the bomber crews mention flames erupting from multiple Zeros. Hansen pointed at the gun ports. You fired short bursts again, didn't you? Reeves nodded. They didn't need much. In the debriefing tent, the pilots gathered around a large map. Their reports were consistent. Zeros ignited quickly. Minimal ammunition was used. The enemy broke off earlier than usual. Major Kincaid studied the notes with his arms folded. This is the first time an entire bomber group returned without damage during a major interception attempt, he said. We need to document every detail. Reeves made no dramatic statements during the debrief. He described the attacks in plain terms: altitude, angle, speed, and the observed ignition effects. But internally, he understood that the new ammunition had fundamentally altered the combat dynamic. For months, the squadron had fought with limited tools against a superior turning aircraft. Now, for the first time, a tactical advantage was shifting in their favor. The pilots left the tent quietly. No one celebrated. They simply knew that the sky had changed. And tomorrow, they would test it again. The days following the Kolombangara engagement brought a noticeable shift in the atmosphere across Fighter Strip Number 2. Pilots still carried fatigue in their movements, and ground crews still worked long hours in humid conditions. But there was now a level of curiosity mixed with caution. The sudden increase in Zero losses had drawn attention from ordnance personnel, intelligence staff, and squadron leadership. On the morning of February 6th, Reeves sat on an overturned fuel drum outside the operations tent, reviewing his mission notes. Each page recorded precise details: ammunition used, burst length, altitude, and observed enemy reactions. His handwriting was orderly, reflecting his habit of approaching missions like technical problems rather than contests of skill. Corporal Hansen approached carrying a wooden crate. "These came in last night," he said. "More of the same rounds from the last shipment. Ordnance wants us to increase the ratio in your belts." Reeves stood and examined the markings on the crate. "How much are they changing it?" "Before, you had one incendiary for every 4-ball or AP rounds," Hansen replied. "Now it's one for every 2. Reeves nodded. "That'll increase ignition chances." "That's the idea," Hansen said. "They're saying aircraft in this theater are especially vulnerable. Fuel systems are exposed. Aluminum's thin. These rounds were designed for situations like this." Nearby, 2 mechanics fed long ammunition belts into the wing-mounted guns of a P-38. The silver-tipped incendiary rounds were spaced evenly along the belt. Reeves watched as a belt rattled slightly with each push into the feed tray. Word about the ammunition had begun spreading across nearby airstrips. Pilots from Marine squadrons, Army fighter groups, and reconnaissance detachments had started asking about the new bullet that reportedly ignited Zeros with minimal hits. Official statements had not been released, but air crews talked among themselves, comparing stories and trying to understand the sudden change. Later that afternoon, a small meeting was held inside a makeshift briefing shelter supported by wooden poles and covered by canvas. Present were Major Kincaid, 2 intelligence officers, Reeves, and several pilots who had flown recent sorties. One of the intelligence officers, Lieutenant Morris, placed a small diagram on the table, a cross-section of the A6M0's fuel system. "This is what we know," Morris said. "Their fuel tanks are non-self-sealing. When punctured, fuel leaks out as vapor. This vapor lingers in the wing cavity. The new rounds ignite on impact, even with minimal penetration." Reeves leaned forward. "So a single hit near the wing root can start combustion?" "Yes," Morris replied. "The chemical compound in the projectile ignites at the moment of impact. It burns fast, but hot enough to ignite any vapor inside the compartment." Kincaid added, "That explains the immediate flames described in yesterday's reports." One of the younger pilots, Lieutenant Fraser, asked, "Why weren't we using these from the start of the campaign?" Morris answered carefully. "These rounds were originally developed for different combat conditions. They were prioritized for the European theater, but later reassessed. The Pacific's aircraft vulnerabilities make them particularly effective here." Reeves studied the diagram again. "So the round didn't change the Zero. It exposed what was already there." Morris nodded. "That's accurate." In the days that followed, pilots began adjusting their firing tactics. They focused more on short, controlled bursts aimed near the wing roots and engine area, locations most likely to contain fuel lines and vapor pockets. The goal was no longer overwhelming firepower, but precision. Japanese pilots also responded to the change, though in ways that varied. Squadron debriefs collected reports of enemy fighters breaking off sooner after initial contact, spreading out their formations, and climbing higher before diving into attacks. Some appeared more cautious, performing shallow passes instead of prolonged engagements. But others remained aggressive. Several encounters resulted in close calls for American pilots, including one where Torrance returned with holes in both wings and a damaged supercharger intake. Even with improved ammunition, the danger remained constant. Reeves observed these changes without assuming the battle had turned in their favor. He had seen too many unpredictable engagements to draw conclusions quickly. But he recognized one undeniable fact. Every pilot now had a better chance of achieving a kill with fewer risks and fewer wasted bursts. On February 9th, Reeves wrote in his journal, "The new round improve our odds, but don't remove the threat. The Zero is still fast in a climb and deadly in a turn. Our aircraft still needs speed and altitude. This is not a replacement for tactics. It's an enhancement." That evening, as the sun set behind the tree line and the runway lights flickered on one by one, the squadron gathered near the edge of the strip. Some pilots cleaned their goggles. Others reviewed cockpit checklists. The mood was focused rather than tense. The new ammunition had not ended the war. It had not made the Zero obsolete, but it had provided something the pilots rarely felt in earlier missions: predictability. The knowledge that a well-placed burst had a high chance of ending the threat. In a theater where survival often depended on seconds, that change was significant. Tomorrow, they would fly again, using the information gathered and the tools now available to them. And the Japanese pilots, knowingly or unknowingly, would face an adversary equipped for their vulnerabilities in a way they had never experienced before. May 9th, 1943, Bougainville region. By early May, the 39th Fighter Squadron had settled into a demanding operational rhythm. Patrol flights, bomber escorts, and interception responses filled nearly every daylight hour. The Japanese maintained steady pressure from bases at Kahili and Balale, launching fighter sweeps designed to disrupt Allied operations across the Central Solomon Chain. On May 9th, Reeves and Torrance were assigned a 2-aircraft reconnaissance protection mission along the northern edge of Bougainville. A pair of F-5 reconnaissance Lightnings, photo-recon variants of the P-38, were scheduled to fly over Kahili Airfield to document runway repairs and aircraft movement. Their survival depended entirely on staying undetected or receiving immediate escort support if spotted. Reeves' task was direct: maintain position above and slightly behind the F-5s. Monitor airspace around Kahili's climb corridor. Engage interceptors before they reached firing distance of the unarmed recon planes. Avoid prolonged combat. Preserve altitude and fuel for return. The F-5s departed first, climbing slowly under heavy camera load. Reeves and Torrance followed a minute later, their P-38s gaining altitude in a wide arc to the west. At 10:11, nearing Kahili's coastline, Reeves saw the recon planes descend slightly to stabilize their camera runs. Below them, the Japanese airfield appeared partially obscured by morning haze, rows of revetments, dispersal pads, and parked aircraft faintly visible. Reeves continued scanning. At 10:15, he spotted them. A rising cluster of aircraft, 10, possibly 12, lifting from the runway and angling upward in a coordinated climb. Their silhouettes were unmistakable. Zeros. He keyed the radio. Recon 1, you have fighters lifting from Kahili. Maintain heading. Torrance and I will intercept. The recon leader answered with a brief acknowledgement. Reeves angled into a dive to build speed. Torrance followed closely, maintaining proper separation. The Zeros climbed aggressively, using tight coordination to close the gap quickly. They aimed directly toward the recon aircraft, aware that unarmed Lightnings were high-value targets. Reeves leveled at 14,000 feet and turned to intercept the lead elements of the formation. The moment he committed, the battle began. The first Zero broke from the climbing column and aimed for Torrance instead of the recon planes. Torrance pulled into a defensive climb, but 2 more Zeros latched onto his tail. Torrance, brake right, Reeves ordered. Torrance rolled hard and spiraled downward, but the Zeros stayed close. Reeves realized the threat and dove sharply to intercept. Gravity pulled at him as the P-38 gained speed. He fired a long, controlled burst. The incendiary rounds struck the nearest Zero across the engine cowling. A sharp flash followed, and the aircraft lost control instantly. The second Zero, startled by the sudden ignition, veered off, giving Torrance enough space to stabilize. "I'm clear," Torrance said, voice unsteady. Reeves didn't respond immediately. He was already climbing back to regain altitude. The remaining Japanese fighters were reorganizing, forming a loose horizontal line in preparation for another attack. Below, the recon aircraft maintained their run, photographing the airfield at set intervals. Their vulnerability increased with every second the Zeros remained airborne. At 10:19, three Zeros broke away from the main group and attempted a high-angle dive toward the F-5s. Reeves reacted instantly, dropping into another intercept path. He lined up behind the trailing Zero and fired short burst. The round struck near the wing root. Immediate ignition. The aircraft broke into a spiraling descent. The other two Zeros abandoned their dive and pulled away sharply to avoid a collision. Reeves could hear Torrance breathing through the radio. Rapid, controlled, focused. "I have one on me again, 200 yards. Reeves banked left, then rolled into a downward turn. He spotted Torrance below, weaving between cloud fragments while a Zero pressed close from behind. Reeves pushed the throttle to maximum. The P-38 surged forward. The nose aligned with the Zero's tail. Reeves fired. The incendiary burst hit the rear fuselage. A brief flame appeared, fed by leaking vapor. The aircraft entered a shallow dive and did not recover. Torrance steadied his plane. "Dan, that was too close." "Climb back to altitude," Reeves replied. "Recon still needs cover." By 10:26, the Japanese fighters began withdrawing. Their losses had been rapid. 3 aircraft destroyed in under 15 minutes. The remaining pilots chose not to re-engage the escorts. The recon mission continued for several more minutes without further interference. Once safely out of range, the F-5s turned back toward Allied lines. Reeves and Torrance rejoined formation, climbing to their assigned escort altitude. The return flight was quiet. The tension from the engagement lingered, but both men remained focused on fuel levels, engine temperatures, and maintaining proper spacing. When they landed shortly after noon, Torrance removed his helmet slowly, his hair damp with sweat. "You saved me twice today," he said. Reeves shook his head. "You position well. They just committed early." Torrance exhaled. "It feels like those incendiaries are doing half the work." Reeves replied after a brief pause. "They help, but you still have to be in the right place at the right time." Later, in the debriefing tent, intelligence personnel examined the mission details. The recon images confirmed Japanese aircraft concentrations at Kahili, while pilot reports documented the effectiveness of the incendiary rounds. 3 Zeros destroyed. The recon planes unharmed. Escort aircraft returned safely. The brass considered it a clear operational success. For Reeves, it reinforced something he had been observing for weeks. The incendiary rounds did not make the Zero less dangerous, but they reduced the length of each engagement. Fewer passes were required. Fewer risks were taken. Each burst carried a higher chance of ending the threat. And in a theater where pilot survival was measured engagement by engagement, that difference mattered more than any headline or statistic. Late 1943, Solomon Islands. By the end of 1943, the tempo of operations across the Solomon Islands had increased steadily. Allied forces were moving north, capturing airfields, pushing supply lines closer to Rabaul, and tightening pressure on remaining Japanese strongholds. For the pilots of the 39th Fighter Squadron, the war had shifted from desperate defense to sustained offensive support. Aircraft revetments now stretched farther along the runway, filled with P-38s in various states of repair. Mechanics worked in rotating shifts organized around long patrol schedules. Intelligence maps were updated daily to track new enemy flight corridors. The squadron had more resources, more aircraft, and more responsibility. What had once been a handful of pilots holding a thin defensive line had become a larger, well-coordinated force carrying out multiple missions each day. Throughout these months, the new incendiary ammunition had become a standard part of the squadron's preparation. Pilots no longer asked about the silver-tipped rounds. They expected them. Ground crews calibrated belts to maximize ignition chances. After-action reports documented repeated instances where minimal hits produced immediate results. Though many pilots appreciated the tactical advantage, none treated it casually. Reeves especially remained analytical in his approach. He understood that the Zero was still dangerous and that an incorrect maneuver or moment of complacency could undo any advantage provided by new equipment. During a briefing in November, Major Kincaid summarized recent squadron performance. Engagement lengths have been reduced by nearly 40% compared to early year averages, he said. That means less exposure, less fuel consumption, and fewer losses. Reeves studied the map as Kincaid spoke. The patterns were clear. Japanese fighters were still active, but their numbers were decreasing. Many of their experienced pilots had been lost during earlier campaigns. The Zeros that did rise to fight often did so from damaged or overcrowded airfields with limited maintenance support. Still, Reeves didn't underestimate them. He remembered every mission where a split-second decision had determined survival. On December 2nd, Reeves flew his final mission of the year, a bomber escort near Bougainville. Though the engagement was brief, it demonstrated how the air war had changed. A small group of Zeros attempted to intercept the formation during its egress. Reeves and 3 other escorts reacted immediately, diving from high altitude. The Zeros pressed their attack for only a few seconds before breaking away. Reeves fired a controlled burst during the maneuver and struck a Zero near the forward fuel line. The impact produced the now familiar ignition flash. The enemy pilot bailed out moments later. The remaining Japanese fighters retreated without pressing further. The bomber group returned safely to base. It was not a dramatic mission. It was not a chaotic or prolonged battle, but it was representative of what the conflict had become. Short, decisive engagements where the improved firepower tipped outcomes in favor of the Americans. Later that evening, Reeves stood near the runway, watching the sun lower behind a ridge of thick jungle. Aircraft returned in a steady stream, landing one by one as ground crews guided them toward revetments. The distant echo of P-38 engines blended with the crackling sound of maintenance crews burning waste material near the tree line. Torrance approached, carrying a canteen. "Debrief says you got another one today," he said. Reeves nodded once. "Short engagement. They didn't push it. Feels like they know what those rounds do," Torrance replied. "Maybe they do," Reeves said. "Doesn't change what they're capable of. We still fly the same way. High altitude, short bursts, controlled passes." Torrance leaned against a crate. "You think the war's turning?" Reeves answered after a few seconds. "It's changing. That's different from turning. But we have better tools than we had when we got here." For the next minutes, they watched the final aircraft of the day land and roll to a stop. The sky dimmed, leaving only the outline of the runway lights reflecting on damp ground. As the months passed, squadron records began to show a clear pattern. Engagement durations shortened. Loss rates decreased. Victory ratios increased. In many cases, the decisive factor had been the ammunition. Steady, consistent, reliable. It didn't make pilots invincible. It didn't remove the danger of flying into combat. But it gave them a measurable advantage in airspace previously dominated by the Zero. When historians later reviewed operational record from the Solomon Islands campaign, they noted the same trend. The introduction of incendiary ammunition had coincided with a significant shift in combat outcomes. The ammunition never became famous. It never received the recognition that aircraft or major battles did. But its impact was evident in mission reports, photographs, and pilot testimonies. For pilots like Reeves, the change had been personal. It reduced uncertainty. It increased survivability. It allowed them to focus more on tactics and less on hoping for the perfect hit. By the end of 1943, the air war over the Solomons was no longer an uneven contest. It had become a technical fight, one where American equipment, coordination, and firepower gradually overcame the agility of Zero. The men who flew these missions didn't celebrate the shift. They simply continued their work, sortie after sortie, until the campaign moved forward and new challenges replaced the ones they had survived. For Reeves, the incendiary round remained a reminder of how small changes, applied consistently and effectively, could alter the balance of a conflict without drawing attention to themselves. The war continued. The missions remained demanding, but the pilots now flew with something they had lacked in the early months of the campaign: a reliable tool that increased their odds of returning home. When the Solomon Islands campaign concluded and Allied forces pushed toward the northern edges of the Pacific, the intensity of daily air combat began to shift. New aircraft, new tactics, and new strategies emerged. Pilots rotated out, replacements arrived, and units reorganized for the next phases of the war. For the 39th Fighter Squadron, the months that followed carried a mix of relief, fatigue, and reflection. Aircraft were repaired or replaced. New supply shipments brought improved equipment. Pilots who had survived the hardest parts of the campaign were assigned to training roles or rotated home. Others remained in theater, continuing the work they had done since the earliest missions. First Lieutenant Daniel Reeves completed his final operational sorties before being reassigned to a stateside training unit. His experience in the Solomon Islands made him a valuable instructor for new pilots preparing to enter combat. His notes, mission reports, and debrief statements were distributed among several groups, contributing to updated tactics for high-altitude engagements and firing discipline. Torrance remained on the island a little longer, flying several more escort missions before eventually joining a replacement pool for operations planned farther north. He later described the months with Reeves as the period in which he learned the foundations of combat aviation: how to manage fear, how to maintain altitude advantage, and how to trust equipment even under extreme pressure. Across the Pacific, historical records began to reflect a subtle but consistent trend. As incendiary ammunition became widely adopted, American fighters achieved higher kill ratios while reducing exposure time during engagements. Missions that once required prolonged firing now often ended after short, controlled bursts. The improvement did not eliminate risk, nor did it replace pilot skill, but it gave American aircrews a measurable advantage at a time when even small changes carried significant consequences. The Japanese Zero remained a capable aircraft, flown by pilots who continued to demonstrate determination despite growing disadvantages. Many of them faced shortages of fuel, declining aircraft quality, and fewer experienced instructors. The shift in air combat outcomes was not caused by a single factor, but the introduction of effective incendiary rounds contributed meaningfully to the changing balance. For Reeves, the significance of the ammunition was straightforward. It did not transform the war. It did not remove danger, but it provided reliability at a moment when reliability often meant survival. During his later years, he described his time over the Solomons not in terms of victories, but in terms of responsibilities: keeping bombers intact, protecting reconnaissance flights, and doing his part to ensure that the squadron could continue functioning despite losses and fatigue. Many pilots from those early campaigns carried lasting memories of the noise, the heat, the sudden appearances of enemy fighters, and the narrow seconds that separated life from loss. The tools they used, the aircraft, the fuel, the radios, the ammunition, were all part of the environment they operated in. Some tools became famous. Others were forgotten. The incendiary round fell into the latter category. Over time, it faded from public attention, overshadowed by later technological developments and larger strategic outcomes. Yet the pilots who flew with it remembered its role during a period when the balance of air combat was uncertain. In the end, the weapon's importance was measured not in headlines, but in missions completed and aircraft that returned with their crews alive. For the men who flew over the Solomon Islands, that was enough.